Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live here with Dr. Patrick Jones from The Unusual Pet Vets. Tonight we are going to talk about that ever important, difficult topic of hormones and reproductive behaviour with our companion parrots. Certainly a topic that comes up a lot with clients and also in vet clinics with clients, social media, forums. Basically, everyone that has a companion parrot is talking about hormones. So we brought Dr. Pat from The Unusual Pet Vets in to have a chat about that because it's a really important topic, and I know that they see a lot of problems in their clinic setting. So welcome, Dr. Pat.
Thank you so much, Lee. Thank you for the opportunity to come on and talk about this topic because it is super, super important and definitely under-recognised.
Absolutely, yeah. So did you want to give us a bit of an intro? Tell us a little bit about yourself, how you got into vetting, and also how that kind of turned into working with birds?
Yeah, of course. So I have always been a lover of birds ever since I was a kid. I was a bird watcher and a bird photographer and still am. I went through vet school and came out and started in mixed practice. So I was working with dogs and cats, birds, wildlife. And it was there that I kind of decided, yeah, I want to narrow in on birds. I did a master's course in avian medicine and surgery through Massey Uni, and then went on and worked in an avian-only practice for a number of years. I sat my avian memberships and then went back and worked as an examiner for those same exams, and then got the job with Unusual Pet Vets. So we have a wide exotic caseload, but there's a lot of avian work and a special interest in avian medicine and surgery, and I love what I do.
Yeah, it's so cool, and it must be such an interesting practice to work in. Just these different species coming through. I know that, it's just even when I pop into the clinic, as obviously I see you guys with my birds, just seeing the different species that are coming through. Or Linda said to me the other day while I was there, she's like, I just got scratched in the face by a turtle. And I was like, how many people get to say that in their day-to-day job? So
you never know what's going to come through the door.
Yeah, that's awesome. Excellent. And congratulations on, passing those exams. I know it's a really rigorous kind of process to get to the point of being a specialty vet in Australia. So it's a really great achievement as well.
Oh, thanks, Lee.
Awesome. Cool. Well, we're going to, I guess, jump straight into it. Hi, Bianca. Bianca said she's here and she's listening. Thanks for joining us. So just really quickly, obviously, if you have any questions, we are definitely going to be answering questions about your hormone and reproductive behaviours. So feel free to pop those in the comments section as we go along. We have a bit of a presentation that Pat's put together for us, which is really fantastic. So we're going to run through that first, and then towards the end, once we've kind of run through all of that, we will start answering questions. So feel free to pop them in as we go, though, and we can scroll back to them and go over them as well. All right, well, we'll jump straight in. So I'm going to bring up Pat's presentation now, and I'll let him get started on that, and then we'll go from there.
Thanks, Lee. Hormones and reproductive issues in companion parrots, it's a really important topic. And unfortunately, a lot of the problems that we see in this area present as life-threatening emergencies or problems that are difficult to manage and difficult to treat. And so I really think there needs to be a lot of emphasis on what can we do to prevent those problems getting to that point in the first place. So the first thing when we if I can get my PowerPoint to work. Yep,
we got it. It's worked.
We got it. The first thing to remember about our companion parrots, and this is logical, but it might not be at the forefront of our minds, is that our pet parrots, for the most part, are not domesticated animals. They are wild animals that are tame. And that means that a lot of their anatomical, physiological, and features and their instincts are pretty much the same as that of a wild bird. That means that they're very, very in tune with their environment. They're very connected with their environment and the conditions that they live in. So for wild birds, that means that if the conditions are appropriate, they will be reproductive. If it's a time of plenty and the conditions are right, they'll find a mate, they'll build a nest, they'll produce eggs, and they'll raise offspring. But when the conditions are not appropriate, they will not be reproductive. Rather than being reproductive, they'll be focusing on maintenance and flocking behaviors. And this is really important to remember, because in captivity, it's really easy to inadvertently provide excessive reproductive stimulus for extended periods of time. And that results in a lot of the problems that we see from a veterinary perspective, both physical and behavioral. And I know for Parrot Life, a lot of the behavioral problems that we see as well. So let's quickly have a chat about some of the problems that we do see. So this, by the way, is not an exhaustive list of problems that we see. These are just some examples. So one of the big physical problems that we see with female birds is egg binding. Now, egg binding itself can happen for a number of different reasons, but ultimately, if a bird is not in a reproductive state, they don't produce eggs and they can't become egg bound. Chronic egg laying is another massive issue. We see that really, really commonly in cockatiels. Cockatiels are probably the poster child of chronic egg laying. Chronic egg laying is a condition where a female bird will produce a number of eggs that is far in excess of what is considered normal for that species or that time of year. And that can have really severe consequences for those birds, because not only are they at risk of becoming egg bound, but every time they produce an egg, they're sapping calcium away from their skeleton, and they're more likely to develop fractures of their limbs, which can be really difficult to manage. We can see oviductal impactions. So what that is when old egg material that's stuck in the oviduct sits there for an extended period of time, that can become infected. Can also result in internal ovulations, and that's basically a condition where a bird will attempt to ovulate and send an egg yolk into her oviduct, but for whatever reason it doesn't enter, or it gets spit back out, and it ends up loose in the abdomen or in the coelom, which causes a really intense inflammatory response, which is really uncomfortable and can have some really nasty side effects. And then there's prolapses in both male and female birds. So male birds, especially cockatiels, are prone to masturbation, which for them can result in prolapse of their cloaca. And female birds that are straining to lay eggs can prolapse as well. And that can have really, really serious consequences. Yeah.
So lots, and I'm assuming you see these on a pretty regular basis coming through the clinic as well.
Absolutely, really frequently.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, so from the behavioural side effects, and I know that you obviously see a lot of these as well, but I'll touch base. So feather damaging behaviour is, and something that I guess I want to say before we jump into the behavioural side of things, and I know this is something that we both agree on, is that we aren't saying that hormones are the be-all and end-all of why these behaviours occur, but rather they are a contributing factor in many cases. They may just exacerbate something that's already occurring. In some cases, they may be a higher contributing factor. It really depends on lots of different things. But usually we find that there's, a few different issues occurring within the home environment that's contributing to these behaviours. But certainly addressing the kind of chronic breeding situation many birds are in helps to reduce these behaviour problems. So I do want to stress that, because we don't, you see a lot of people saying, oh, it's hormones. And I've seen, oh, it's hormones for behaviour problems in birds that are babies still as well. So it can be quite concerning how often we just kind of say, oh, it's hormones. And then there also seems to come along with that, oh, it's hormones and you just have to put up with it, which I think is the bigger problem, because it means that people are often then not feeling like they have a way to address that. And we're certainly going to talk about ways that we can address that tonight. So feather damaging behaviour. This is probably one of the more emotionally distressing behaviours that people can kind of see in birds that might be experiencing a breeding flush. So that is where the bird engages in, it might present in different ways. It can be just barbering the feathers, where they're chewing off the ends of the feathers, but not necessarily pulling them from the follicle. it can present like the eclectus that you have here, which is where the bird has pulled the feathers, primarily pulled them out from the follicle. And in this case, they've removed both down and the coverts and the collared feathers. And it can also present as self-mutilation in extreme cases where the bird actually chews into their own skin and does significant and very concerning damage to their body in that way. That's a fairly, I guess, extreme presentation. And obviously you'd be able to speak to how much you see that, because I think probably most people's first stop when they're seeing self-mutilation is going to be the vet and not myself to start off with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yes, further damaging behaviour, and like I said, very emotionally distressing for the humans involved in that situation.
Yeah.
Awesome. Aggression, absolutely. So this is probably, aggression is probably one of the, along with screaming, are probably the two main complaints that we get, that we certainly see exacerbated by or enhanced by breeding flushes in birds. So aggression might present as aggression towards particular humans in the household. It might be all humans in the household. It might be other birds or animals within the household. And it can range from anything as, minor as, growling and lunging to doing very significant damage, and even, in some cases, I've had clients who've had bones broken by the larger species of birds. So it can be really serious, and especially when we're talking about birds who are often sitting close to our faces because they're sitting on shoulders, it's actually a really concerning problem behaviour. And aggression isn't only, again, hormonal. I see a lot of fear-based aggression as well, where the birds are just nervous or have been, poorly handled in the past and are responding to that. But again, breeding hormones can exacerbate that behavior that may already exist. So separation anxiety, this is a big one. If your bird is inappropriately bonded to a particular human in the household and they're experiencing a breeding flush, then often they don't like being separated from that perceived mate, and that will lead to significant distress for the bird and significant distress to other people in the household and sometimes neighbours, unfortunately, because it usually exhibits as screaming. But it can also, include the bird refusing to engage in normal behaviours such as foraging or just eating from a bowl. It can lead to pacing and respiratory distress and things like that. I've certainly seen birds with some serious separation distress based behaviours. Screaming, which does fall under separation anxiety as well, but we also just see screaming that may not be accompanied by particular separation distress. So that's a really big one that we get called out for, and it really increased over COVID. There was a lot of calls for screaming during COVID, and especially after, when suddenly people went back to work. So and then chronic masturbation. This is the fun one. So presents a lot in male eclectus parrots. It's very common in male eckies. Obviously, this is both disturbing for the human family. It also means that the bird's not engaging in normal behaviour because they are spending way too much time engaging in this kind of chronic masturbation behaviour. It can also lead to physical injuries as well if they're engaging in that behaviour quite a lot. So these are probably the primary issues that we see that are kind of related to breeding behaviour.
And the other thing I would add to that, Lee, is that especially aggression and screaming are probably some of the most common reasons why birds end up getting relinquished to shelters, which is really sad to see, because these things can be managed if addressed appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think I would also add that those are probably the two there that also have a lot of other contributing factors. So
absolutely.
Lots of learning history there where the bird has been reinforced for those behaviours in the past. And so they'll often get, headlined under hormones. But when I go out and actually investigate the case and talk to the client, what I actually find is that there's just this really long history of that animal being heavily reinforced for those behaviors and learning that that's an effective way of getting what they want or need or creating space when they're uncomfortable. So I think that's also really important, is that, you know, again, it might be exacerbated by breeding flushes, but certainly in many cases that I see, there are a lot of other environmental factors going on that are kind of contributing to those behaviors. So
yeah, absolutely. So a holistic approach is, yeah, so important.
absolutely. Yeah. Just really quickly, Laura Reed has asked if the video will be available to rewatch another time. Laura, yes, it will. It'll be remain available on both our Facebook page and our YouTube channel going forward. So if you can't stick around for the whole thing, feel free to ask your questions and head off, and we'll still answer those. Awesome. Back to you, Pat.
Cool. All right, so because we're talking about reproductive hormones, it makes sense to talk about the physiology involved in that so that we can better understand it and better manage it. This is a bird's brain. It doesn't look like a brain, but I assure you it is. Just bear with me. This is going to get a little bit complicated, but bear with me. Once we get through it, it'll make sense why we've gone through this. So all vertebrate animals, let me just get this working. All vertebrate animals have a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, which is an area in the brain that's responsible for a number of different biological processes. But it is also the starting point for many of the hormonal systems in our body, including the reproductive hormones. So the hypothalamus produces a hormone called GnRH, which travels down to a gland just below the hypothalamus called the pituitary gland. So under the influence of GnRH, the pituitary gland will release luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And those hormones will travel via the bloodstream down to the gonads. So in a female bird, that's the ovary. Our companion parrots, or all parrots, only have one ovary. In fact, most birds only have one ovary. There's some species that have two. Kiwis have two, falcons have two, but for the most part, it's just one. Or if you're a male bird, the testicles. And in birds, obviously, the testicles are internal. They're inside the body. So under that influence, the ovary or testicles will go on to produce estrogen and testosterone, which ultimately results in the reproductive behaviors that we see, mating and egg production. Now, this is not always successful, and often we see the problems that we spoke about earlier, the chronic egg laying, the egg binding, the aggression issues that we spoke about. The hypothalamus doesn't just produce GnRH for fun. It does it under the influence of certain internal and external factors. So some of those factors are nutritional, some are environmental, some are social, and some are genetic. So these things are acting on the hypothalamus to kickstart this hormone cascade that results in reproductive behaviors. So a lot of you are probably aware of hormone implants or hormone medications that can be used in parrots to help manage reproductive problems. And as avian vets, we certainly do use those as part of a more holistic approach. Now, those hormones, those treatments work at this level. So they block the signal between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. But would it not make more sense to manage these factors before the hypothalamus gets stimulated in the first place? And that's really what we're focusing on today. What can we do at home to help reduce the drive on the hypothalamus and reduce these reproductive behaviors and reduce the likelihood of these reproductive problems occurring? Now, the hormone medications are certainly used in certain situations, but we always pair that with appropriate husbandry modification to reduce the drive on the system in the first place. So I've got a couple of cases that I wanted to share with you just to kind of show some of the things that we're seeing at vet clinics with our avian patients. This was a 9-year-old Indian ringneck who had never, ever laid an egg before. And her presenting complaint when she came to the clinic was that she had poo stuck around her vent. And that was it. There was no other clinical signs that there was a problem. And so on physical exam, I found that she had a very hard round structure inside her belly, inside her coelom. And what was happening was that egg had been sitting there for some time. It had changed the direction of her cloaca. And as a result, every time she passed droppings, they were getting stuck to her feathers, which is what the owner saw. Now, by the time we saw this bird, she had completely given up trying to lay this egg, and her body was moving out of a reproductive state, which meant that that egg was just sitting in there doing nothing. And eventually it was going to become a pretty serious problem for her. Often in these cases, we can use medical management to help these birds pass these eggs naturally, but sometimes that's not an option, and we do have to take a more aggressive approach. In this case, this bird had a procedure called a coeliotomy and a salpingotomy, which is where we open up the belly and we open up the oviduct and actually remove the egg. And she recovered well from that surgery. In this case, we did use a hormone implant to quickly decrease that reproductive stimulus on her body. So in that picture on the right there, you can see Dr. Alex is placing a supralorin implant in this bird. But of course, we're pairing that with recommendations for this owner on how to reduce the reproductive drive in the first place.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This next case is an African grey parrot. She is 28 years old and had never laid an egg before. And her presenting complaint was that she was unwell. She was lethargic and she wasn't eating. You can see there she's got 2 collapsed eggs inside her body. A bird should never have more than 1 egg in their body at any one time. The fact that there's 2 there, apart from them being collapsed, is an indicator that something is going very wrong here. We attempted to remove the material through her vent, but were unsuccessful, and so unfortunately she had to have surgery as well. But she did very well. We removed that nasty egg material. Her oviduct was quite inflamed and uncomfortable, and I don't think it would have taken long for her to develop an infection if her owner hadn't sought intervention quickly. But again, she went home with tools and techniques to help decrease her reproductive drive. And then, sorry, go ahead, Lee.
No, I was just, gosh, at 28, it's such a late stage, and so many people would just assume that, you know, if your bird's that age and they've not laid an egg, either they're not a girl and the DNA sexing was wrong, or they're just not going to. So
that's absolutely right, and yeah, out of nowhere, this bird laid this egg. So, and this client was very experienced and had kept a lot of birds in the past. So, you know, it just goes to show that these things can happen. And that's why managing these problems before they become problems is really important.
Yeah.
And the third case that I wanted to mention was a sun conure. This is not the sun conure in the story, but it's the only picture that I could find. So this was a male sun conure who was really heavily bonded with the female owner, and it was quite tragic because when that bird was in a reproductive state, he would become really aggressive to the male owner. The male owner was hearing impaired, and this bird would fly across the room and attack him. And so he never knew when he was going to be bombarded by this bird. And anyone that's been bitten by a sun conure knows they can bite. They can bite very, very hard. So this poor gentleman was being attacked. This was, it was a real issue. It was meaning that this bird was having to be, isolated in a cage and couldn't come out. And, that's just terrible for this individual. And when we dug deeper with this case, we identified that this bird was experiencing this reproductive drive. This bird was fed a diet that was very, very high in calories, and Lee and I will speak about that a bit more soon. But in this case, this bird's diet was modified to reduce the energy level in the diet, and that was enough to reduce the reproductive drive to the point where the bird was no longer aggressive to the male partner. And I think that really highlights how important managing the drivers is in these cases. Would you agree, Lee?
Yes, absolutely. So 100%. And that's, like you said, that's such a big, it highlights, and, that's wonderful. It's not always the case that, just making those changes just making that one change can have such a big effect. But, there are cases, and I said this to you before we jumped on, where I have also gotten very similar feedback, a week, 2 weeks after I've seen a client, and it's just, some changes in the diet have made a really big impact on the bird's overall behavior. So, sometimes it feels like a bit of a magic wand, I think, for some people, but also keeping in mind that's not always, there's usually a bit of training in that needs to really go into the behavior as well. So yes, and sun conure is the only bird that I've ever gotten bitten by during a consult. So flying sun conure to the face.
They can be a weapon. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So and that's a really common behavior problem. A big complaint that we see is that, the bird is really bonded to one person in the household, and much to the detriment of anybody else that lives in that house. And that can obviously make it a very precarious situation for the bird and for the people in the family.
Absolutely. And of course, sometimes that aggression can be directed towards the person that the bird is bonded with as a redirected aggression, which can be really heartbreaking for someone that has a really strong bond with this bird, and then it's aggressive to them, and it doesn't seem clear why that's happening.
That's as I said, further destructive behavior certainly is probably one of the most emotionally charged problems that I see, but certainly up there is aggression, especially when that aggression is directed at the person who wanted the bird in the first place. So very heartbreaking. Often, and so something I wanted to, I guess, come back to as well is, and this is more of a medical side of things, but that case, with those first two cases with that the ringneck and the African grey, are really good at highlighting why even small changes in behaviour should be immediately investigated, because even waiting 24 hours in some cases can actually be incredibly detrimental or possibly fatal in some instances for birds if they're unwell. So, I'm surprised that Indian ringneck was okay at that stage. So.
Yeah. It's just remarkable, and as we know, the tricky thing about avian patients is that they are prey animals. In the wild, if you're in a flock and you show any sign of illness, you're the first individual that gets eaten by a predator, and that means they're very, very good at hiding illness. And it just goes back to them being wild birds that are tame. They will hide that illness until they cannot, and sometimes that means that they end up in a critical state.
Absolutely. Awesome. It was really interesting, and the little bit of information about the brain and how that all inputs, I think, is really interesting for people to kind of understand what we're attempting to do with the interventions that we're going to suggest. It's really about, as you said, kind of blocking all of those those three kind of contributing factors before it even sets that cascade off in the first place. And like you said, we'll talk a bit, I think, about hormone implants, because I think it's important to talk about when those are a solution, I guess, or an intervention that we can trial. But we'll talk about those environmental factors first. So cool. So I guess we'll just backwards and forwards here. I know that we probably make many of the same recommendations basically to our clients. So I have no doubt that we're just going to be nodding and agreeing with each other primarily. So I guess from your perspective, do you have a particular intervention that you find is kind of your number one starting point for your clients when they come in with issues that seem related to reproductive behavior?
Yeah, so I guess it really depends on the case, because in some cases there are certain environmental factors that are, alarm bells are going off and this is a big contributor, or there's social factors. But I think most cases tend to benefit a lot from the nutritional side of things. And if we go back to those wild birds and we think about nutrition, if you have food available that's really easy to get to and it's high in energy, that is really conducive to reproduction. And so a lot of the times companion birds are fed a high energy diet. So they're fed either lots of seeds or nuts or high energy fruit and certain high energy vegetables like peas and corn. And we deliver that in a bowl and we wonder why they become reproductive. We're basically asking them to become reproductive. So I would say there's no perfect diet for companion parrots, but there are certainly specific valuable recommendations we can make. It varies depending on the species, so different species will have different requirements. But generally, for our seed-eating parrots, we're going to be recommending low portions of seed and nuts as part of the diet, a good quality pellet, and then lots of low energy or medium energy vegetable matter. It does vary. Different species have different requirements, so it's definitely worth speaking, with an avian vet or with an avian behaviorist to get an idea of what is appropriate for your species. But there's certainly big issues with excessive energy. The diet that a bird will eat in the wild at the best of times is low in energy, and they spend 80% of their time searching for food and expending energy. No matter how much your bird exercises in captivity, it will not compare to what a wild bird does. So we really need to be focusing on the low energy diet where appropriate. And then, of course, is how we deliver the food to the birds. I know that Parrot Life has a really big emphasis on foraging, and I think that that's incredibly important. It's easy to fall in the trap of thinking that foraging is just providing fun food items. That's not really what it is. Yeah. I see you can buy forage mixes and you can buy seed sticks. None of that is really foraging. That is just providing.
Those foraging mixes are like, everyone's like, we use this foraging mix, and it's like just seeds and nuts.
Yeah. It's the opposite of what we want because it's so high in energy. Do you want to talk a bit about foraging and how you encourage your clients to get their birds foraging, Lee?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as you said, and I think it's really important and I'm going to circle back, I think, to also talking about some of the misconceptions around I've got a frugivore or I've got a this or a seed eater, because I think that's part of the problem as well. People are like, well, I've got this species and they're a frugivore in the wild, so therefore I need to feed them fruit. And it's like, no, for a number of reasons. But foraging is incredibly important because, as you said, wild birds are obviously expending a lot of energy just getting access to the food. And when they're in captivity, we often just present it in a bowl. They sit there, they eat it for 2 or 3 minutes, they're full, and now they've got this, they're full of energy. And there's nowhere for it to go. They're not engaging in any of these natural behaviors. And they're not outputting energy just getting access to the food in the first place either. And so foraging is one of those ones that, it's good for the bird just mentally. It's, you're going to have a happier, healthier bird if they're foraging. They've got a job, they keep busy, they work their brain and their body in ways that are, hopefully natural to them. Not all foraging is going to be natural just because it is captivity and we do what we can with what we've got. But it also means that, when we're talking about, okay, cool, we need a lower energy diet because our bird's in a reproductive flush. When we then also combine that lower energy diet with the need to work to get access to that low energy diet, then suddenly the bird goes, wait a second, I definitely don't have enough food here to feed myself and feed chicks in the nest, which is often, I guess that's how I explain it to a client. I'm like, when you're feeding this giant bowl full of food, what they do is they sit there and they're like, this is perfect. I don't have to work hard to get this. It's full of, all of these really high calorie foods. If I need to feed babies, this is the perfect time to do it. It's in abundance. So what we want to do is cut down that abundance, cut down the energy, and then go, now you also need to work for this food that's, enough for you, but not enough for another bird and several chicks in the nest. And so foraging is a great way to do that, but it has all of those side benefits as well of just, mentally enriching your bird's life and giving them things to do. It builds confidence, just like us. When they get the opportunity to break things down and problem solve, that builds confidence, and that creates good feelings as well. So it creates a cascade of other hormones that we do want them to experience, those dopamine and serotonin, which make them feel good about themselves. So, we get clients started with, depending on, whether the birds forage before or not. A lot of people don't realize that birds don't just come pre-programmed to forage. It's something that they would learn from their parents in the wild. And so we need to actually teach them. Often people say, I tried foraging, and they're like, they've got one of those polycarbonate toys, which are great, but not if your bird has never foraged before, because they're hard. That's grade 12 foraging activity. We want to start with something that's really simple. And so, probably one of my favorite foraging activities for starter birds is foraging trays, which is like, it can be the top of one of those open, you get those cages that have the play top on it. It can be the top of that. It can be a shallow cardboard box. It can be a cat litter tray. Depends on the size of your bird. I don't recommend any large boxes, because some birds will think that that's a fun little nest. But shallow trays are great. And to start with, basic substrate, it could be just a little bit of, we recommend the 100% recycled newspaper cat litter that you can get, called Breeder's Choice, and that's often a good starting point. And we'll just get them to put a little bit in there, and put some of their pellets and a little bit of something delicious in there, a little bit of seed or a little bit of broken up nuts, a very small portion, and just get them started that way. It's visible, it's easy, it's usually, even if your bird's a little bit nervous of new things, it usually works really well. And then you can make it harder by adding more and more substrate and less food over time, and it's a nice introduction to foraging. And then the other one that I get clients to do is what we call paper twisties. And if you're not in our Facebook group, we've got a Facebook group called Parrot's Life, and in there I have done an intro to foraging video that kind of shows what paper twisties are. But basically we get a little bit of food, we put it inside a little bit of paper, and we twist it into the end, and then just hold it out for the bird to chew through, because they don't necessarily immediately understand that just because you can't see food doesn't mean it's not there. And so by teaching them to look for the food inside of something, and that if you chew through the paper there's food, it can be a nice intro. And then you can start putting the paper inside other toys and gradually making it more difficult, and working up to things like your baffle cages and those polycarbonate toys, and creative ideas that you come up with. And we post videos on our Facebook page every Friday with foraging ideas that we do with our own birds. So those are kind of the intros that we do to foraging. And like I said, I think when I talk about diet and feeding with clients, what I'm talking about is like both the abundance and the calorie content of food, but also the foraging is, as far as I'm concerned, part of just standard diet and feeding. And I guess the one other concern that I see with foraging is for those clients who are doing it is often they're just repeating the same things over and over again. And what I try and recommend to my clients is making sure that it's varied. Do whatever you do today, do something different tomorrow, because we want to keep it varied and different, because otherwise they get really good at things really quickly. And just like us, if we're doing the same thing day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, it becomes rote, and eventually it's not providing that what we're wanting from it anymore. It's not providing those good hormone feelings anymore, and it's not necessarily wearing off the energy we want to wear off. So, and really quickly, the other thing I do is I usually recommend clients use pellets as part of their foraging, because often what's happening is, in order to do foraging, clients are often using a lot of nuts and seeds. So inadvertently, they're feeding a lot of high energy food in foraging activities. And so I try and really encourage clients to use at least a portion of their day-to-day pellets, if not all of them, in foraging activities. And you can provide more than your bird needs if your concern is whether they're getting enough food or they have access to food while you're out at work all day. But just make it so that they have to work to get access to it. So rather than, like I said, adding in lots of high energy foods for foraging, use part of their day-to-day meals to do that.
Oh, yeah, I couldn't agree more, Lee. Absolutely. And I think the point you made about their staple diet being achieved or being acquired through foraging, I think that's really important. The only time where I wouldn't recommend that is if I have a bird that has a medical problem. But otherwise, for most birds, we want them to get to work for all of their food, because that's what they're going to do in the wild. And like you say, it's really easy to inadvertently give too much energy through foraging. So obviously we're going to start with high energy rewards with foraging to get them interested in new foraging activities, but then we back off the energy over time. The other thing I would suggest is intermittently putting high energy treats and rewards in with our foraging, but make it unpredictable. So our birds don't know when something really yummy is going to be found. So it kind of increases that anticipatory foraging behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, extra motivation there, because like you said, they just never know when that little bit of nut or that sunflower seed's going to pop up in their foraging activity. It keeps them, it's that, keeps you at the pokey machine, right? Because you never know when that jackpot's going to happen.
That's it. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So, I mean, and that's a topic that I feel like I could probably talk about for hours. So foraging, it's so interesting, and it's just such a great way to, like, in this case, we're talking specifically about how we can use it to help with these reproductive issues, but it's also just incredibly beneficial for a lot of reasons. So
absolutely. I think it's super under-recognized, and it's one of the biggest discrepancies between a captive bird and a wild bird is how they obtain their food. So that's so important. Yeah.
And then, so like I said, the other thing I wanted to circle back on and get you a little bit of, I guess, your opinion on is the I've got a frugivore, and this is probably, eckies are the one that you see it with the most. I've got a frugivore, they need fruit. Or I've got a, cockatiel, they eat seed. And so you see these diets that, where people are attempting to do what they think is appropriate because, that's what they've been told. What's, I guess, your kind of take on that and your thoughts about those sorts of more specialized feeders? Lorikeets is the other one I see a lot of as well, where it's like, I've got a lorikeet, so they eat fruit and they eat nectar, and that's it.
It's hard because absolutely a lot of these specialist feeders are going to be eating more volume of a particular foodstuff, but the trap that's really easy to fall into is assuming that the foodstuff that we have to use as an alternative in captivity is appropriate is often not the case. So a lot of cultivated fruits are really, really high in energy and not much else, and they're very, very different to the fruit that an eclectus parrot would be eating in the wild. So feeding a diet high in fruit to an eclectus parrot is just a recipe for ending up with a bird that is overweight or has all sorts of health or behavioral problems. So I think we should be focusing on providing a balanced diet. I do think that an eclectus parrot maybe can have a little bit more fruit than the average bird, but I think that a diet that focuses on a high quality commercial pellet, and then those medium and low energy vegetables with less fruit, and then small amounts of seeds and very small amounts of nuts, not a large part of the diet. For our more kind of granivorous species, so cockatiels in particular, certainly I do think that seed should make up a larger portion of that species diet, because they are more prone to developing kidney issues if they eat excessive amounts of pellets. So again, it's about balance. They do need to have a little bit more seed than the next species, but we don't want them to be eating only seed. And I think the other thing is let's try and use native browse as much as we can. So seeding grasses, fresh blossoms, that sort of thing, to try and get a bit more natural food into their diet. For lorikeets, of course, lorikeets are tricky. They have a really sweet tooth. They're really hard to get to eat their low energy veggies. But by the same token, we don't want to just be flooding them with sugary fruit and just low quality commercial nectars or powders. I definitely think it's worth getting a good quality lorikeet powder and trying to reduce the amount of fruit that we're feeding those birds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like, if I was going to say if there's any species that I work with that diet change has the biggest effect on, it's probably lorikeets, because almost 100% of the time they'll be being fed a really high energy diet when I get there. And like I said, people are trying to do the right thing. They think that this is a nectar feeder. They eat just lots of sugar in the wild. But again, like you said earlier, they're not flying those, however many kilometers per day just to get access to. And lorikeets have to work really hard for their diet.
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
hard. But then in captivity, they're not.
Absolutely.
And so I see a big difference in lorikeets, especially when we make changes to those diets, but also other species. And you touched on it as well, that what we grow for ourselves, the fruit that we like it really sweet. It's not the same as what a bird is eating in the wild. What we call fruit in the wild is actually very different nutritionally. There's a lot more fiber and a lot less fructose in those. And so it's actually closer to what we call vegetables.
Yeah.
So, awesome. I did want to touch on that because it is something that we see obviously really often is, people talk about these specialist feeders or these frugivores and then inadvertently feeding kind of what they think is an appropriate diet that actually just creates some issues. So
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, we can talk about diet all day as well, I think. So we'll leave that there and kind of move on to the next step. So from diet, what are kind of the next steps that you talk to clients about?
Yeah, so the next category of things that we need to look at is the environment, and there's a couple of topics under that heading. The first one is, are we inadvertently providing a nest site? Because in the wild, availability of a nest site is one of those contributing factors to reproduction. And so when we see our birds looking for a nest site and going in the drawers or behind the cushions or getting all snuggly in their happy hut, or even if we're providing a nest box, that might indicate to us that they're in a
down shirts is another one I see really often as well.
Absolutely. Not only is that indicating to us that they're in a reproductive state, but it's stimulating them as well. So I think the first thing is just denying access to those sites. Lee will agree with me on this, that happy huts are the worst. They're problematic from a behavioural perspective, but also they're a really big cause of foreign body obstructions in a lot of species. These birds will be sitting in there getting all snuggly and nibbling on the fibres that are in there, and the owner might not even notice that they're doing it until it gets to the point that they're lethargic and vomiting and they have an obstruction in their bowel from the accumulation of those little fibres. So certainly, removing happy huts, removing nest boxes, denying access to hidey holes, so denying access to behind the cushions or in drawers or down your shirt, those sorts of things. We want to prevent access to those nesty areas. Another big one, especially in cockatiels, is if we have paper on the bottom of the cage and the birds are getting in under the paper, it might be worth moving that paper underneath the grid so the bird can't get under it and get all nesty.
No, it makes it easier sometimes because the grid stays clean, but yes, there are some species where that just is just another trigger. And then talking about, specific species, the other one I see people, saying, oh, let your lovebird, peel off paper and stick it in their feathers. But that's a nesting behavior, guys. Don't let your lovebird do that, unfortunately, or Quakers, kind of allowed to gather things and build those very intricate, amazing nests that they build, but unfortunately then we are really contributing to those problem behaviors, and unfortunately with Quakers it's often flying at people's faces, so probably not what we want to be encouraging them to do. So definitely nesting spaces is a big one, and I do want to acknowledge here how difficult human houses are for keeping birds out of hollows. We've got TV units and bookcases and buffets and our houses are full of cavities, and it can be really difficult. And then, I was saying to you before we started here that, I've worked with birds where they're like, this corner in the kitchen is great. And it's literally just a corner. There's nothing there. It's not covered. It's not particularly dark or nesty, but this bird is like, this is my nest now. And then aggressive behavior to keep people away from that corner. And so it can be really hard. But you do what you can, and again, I've seen some pretty big changes in birds with, kind of identifying, people were like, didn't realize that that's what their bird was doing. And we've gone, okay, cool. Well, your bird is treating this space as a nest or this space as a nest, so let's, make some changes so they can't, and it, can have a really big effect on the behavior. But also you need to look at those other areas as well, because sometimes it is hard to prevent cavity seeking. So.
Absolutely. And I think that just highlights the fact that sometimes these birds will get into places that it's really hard to prevent. And it highlights the importance of the bigger picture and managing all of the drivers that we can. There's going to be some reproductive drivers that might be outside of our control. So we focus on the things that we can control. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. The other point you mentioned before with lovebirds and Quakers and shredding paper and that sort of thing. A nest site is one thing, but also nest material is another thing. So if we're providing paper and a bird is shredding that paper for the purpose of nesting, then we need to deny access to that nest material. It makes it a bit tricky when a lot of our foraging relies on paper to perform that. But if we perform our foraging activities correctly and we have a low energy diet, hopefully our birds are going to be less interested in nesting in the first place and use those foraging activities for what they're meant for. Yeah.
It might just mean modifying what we're doing for short periods of time while we get everything under control, and then being able to reintroduce those things back as well. So certainly, sometimes you have to be very creative with your foraging with some birds.
Absolutely.
So,
absolutely.
And we were saying earlier as well that some birds will nest in the most ridiculous spaces, like food bowls. And so this is also another great reason to get rid of your food bowls. Feed the bird from something else, because if they're not able to sit in their food bowl and treat it like a nest, then we've just removed that access to that as a starting point as well. So
absolutely. So under the environmental kind of heading, the next thing I probably would be important to mention is day length. So increasing day length for a lot of our species is a reproductive driver, because as day length increases, it means that we're coming into a time of year when there's more likely to be food available, so we're more likely to be reproductive. And I'm sure you see that a lot as well, Lee, but we see a lot of people that, their birds are up until midnight. And if the bird's not up until midnight, they might be sleeping in a cage that's in an area of the house where they're not undisturbed. So even though that cage is covered, there's still light, there's still sound. That bird is not really sleeping. It's not really getting a proper nighttime until those lights are switched out and everybody goes to bed. So just restricting our day length hours, but it's more effective for some species than others. So for really tropical species, where in the wild day length doesn't change very much, it's not as much of a driver, but it's still something to consider, that we don't want our birds staying up all night. It is ideal if we can have our birds sleep somewhere where they're completely undisturbed. So in a separate room is ideal. I know that's not it's not feasible for everyone, but we just do our best to have our birds sleep in a low traffic area in the house so that they can get that rest. And
a couple of notes on that. I mean, sleep is important for everybody. And if you're having behavior problems with your bird and they're not getting enough sleep, even if they're not in a breeding flush, they might be cranky because they're not getting enough sleep. I know that, I certainly get cranky, and disturbed sleepers, it actually has some really serious effects on our brains. And so I think that's important to kind of mention as well, that it doesn't even necessarily always just have to do with breeding, but sleep is critical to health, behavioral and physical. And then I also, like you said, it's not necessarily suitable for all species, and that's where I do want to mention that it's a good idea to know a bit about your species and what their breeding patterns are like in the wild, because there are some species that breed at slightly different times of the year to what we expect. So it is a good idea to know a bit more about your own species as well, so you're not applying something that might actually make things worse for you rather than better. So that's another way. And the other thing that I do want to touch base on here, because I do see it, I think that, like you said, getting them into a quieter space of the house, out of the main traffic area, in a different room, can be really helpful. But to be cautious of doing fully covered blacked out cages, because I see birds that then treat the cage like a nest space. So in our attempt to reduce our hormone trigger, we inadvertently create a second hormone trigger. So it's finding that balance as well. And that might just mean that, if you're covering them up, that, you leave the bottom not totally covered, so there's a bit of, open there, little things like that. And again, it's very individual in some cases as well. What's triggering one bird may not be triggering another bird. So
absolutely. And what you just mentioned about leaving the bottom uncovered, I think that's important in general, because I do believe that we do see some cases where birds present with respiratory issues, and sometimes that's related to poor ventilation. So I think leaving that bottom third of the cage uncovered is good from a reproductive perspective, but also from a health perspective, in that it facilitates ventilation. We don't have stuffy air sitting in there with the bird throughout the night.
Yeah. I think the other thing, and again, this is kind of off topic for breeding, but people don't realize, and there are certain species that are prone to things like night frights and stuff. And I think when it's totally blacked out, that for some birds that can actually be really disorientating, because they can't see anything. If there's a noise in the room that they're in, they don't know what it is. They may panic because they just can't see anything. And so
and they can't get their bearings.
Yeah, dark and quiet, absolutely. Does it need to be pitch black, guys? No, it doesn't need to be pitch black, because if you walk outside at nighttime, it is not pitch black outside. So, and I think that's a little bit of a myth that's popped up, along with the, they need XYZ amount of sleep, and then somewhere along the line that turned into, but it needs to be in perfectly dark space, and it's no, perfectly dark space is more like a nest. And also there's these other potential concerns there as well. So definitely,
absolutely,
awesome, excellent.
I think the next environmental the thing to be wary of is rainfall. For certain species, especially arid species, rainfall events can trigger reproduction. And when we have periods of extended rainfall, we do tend to see more reproductive problems, especially in cockatiels. And there's nothing that you can do to control the rain. Even if those birds are inside, they're going to be hearing and feeling the rain. So you can't do anything about that. But you can control how much you're misting your bird or taking it in the shower. So, if you're having a bird that's, at risk of developing those sorts of issues, then I would minimize, the shower time or the misting time. Yeah. And I think that this last year, the last 18 months, has been a really big contributing factor, because we've had so much rain here in Queensland. And I know that obviously Sydney and New South Wales and Victoria and we've just experienced some really significant rain events the last 12 to 18 months. And I've noticed an increase in, people saying, my bird seems way worse this year than last year or previously. And I think that, that the precipitation has probably contributed to that a bit, that we've just had so much. So it's certainly, something to be. And I guess, again, if you're just aware of it, it also means that you go, okay, cool. Well, I know that we've had a big rain year, and I've got a bird who might react to that. So I'm going to be really careful with their diet coming into, what would be their breeding season. And you can make changes. Like you said, you can't control the rainfall, but there are other things you can do at home with regards to how we're bathing, misting, showering our birds, and also just, being aware of other triggers as well. Yes. Yeah. Looking at it from a holistic perspective again. Yeah, absolutely. The next environmental kind of heading that I would mention is the presence of a territory. So certainly, and this needs to be done with caution, because we don't want to put too much stress on our birds, but rearranging cage furniture can introduce a degree of environmental stress that reduces that bird's kind of perception of its territory. So it can be useful, but I also think we need to be careful in that we're not just kind of throwing environmental instability at this bird and causing stress, from a different angle.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, if you've got a bird who's pretty confident, doesn't worry too, it doesn't show significant signs of distress when you change their cage furniture around or switch toys in and out and things, then it can be a great way. But like you said, you do have to be cautious if you've got, African greys come to mind, because they can be really, not all, but some can be very specific about how they like things, and can get quite upset if you change things around. And so, and even like for those birds, it may just be that you change one tiny thing and that's enough. That's enough. You don't actually have to change everything in the cage. Whereas some other birds, you might just go, let's do a whole rearrange, and the bird's like, this is fine, I don't mind. But it helps, like you said, with those drivers. So absolutely. And I mean, you can even, again, depending on your bird and your setup, you could even switch the position of the cage, taking into account things like, what's out the window, and how much can they get away from windows, what else is going on within the household. We don't want to move them into a space where we're going to cause them significant stress or create other problem behaviors, but even just shifting the location of a cage can be a helpful kind of way of dealing with that as well.
Absolutely, definitely.
I think that's probably a lot of the environment. Have you got anything?
The only other thing that I'd add, and it's a bit of a difficult one because it doesn't really fall under any heading, but we'll put it in the environmental section, and that is removing eggs from a bird that is brooding. It depends on the species, but some species are what we call indeterminate layers, which means that they will, if you remove an egg, they will replace it. So if you keep removing eggs in an attempt to stop them from being reproductive, you're stimulating them to lay more eggs. So just as a general rule, I would say if your bird does produce some eggs, I'd leave them with her for 3 weeks to let her brood them, rather than taking them away and potentially triggering her to try and replace those eggs that have been removed. The other thing is to replace them with ceramic eggs that you can purchase, and then if they crack, it's not a problem.
Yes, that's a big one, because we do see that, and sometimes people, like you said, will just remove them thinking that's the best thing to do, and for some birds it just actually triggers more and more. Cockatiels are probably the biggest one that comes to mind for myself.
That's what I'm thinking
and
of.
They'll just lay and lay and lay and lay and lay until they're sick.
Absolutely.
So it's something to be really cautious of. But once they start that process of egg laying, you're better off just letting them kind of sit on those eggs, brood them, abandon them. And then, you've got to be careful, obviously, when they're brooding eggs, not to do significant diet changes or anything like that, because you don't want to. They need nutrition at that point. But at the same time, we need to start thinking about how we're going to prevent this from, reoccurring immediately after they've decided to ditch those eggs because they're not hatching. So, and that's where all of those other things we've talked about can come into play. And like I said, we'll come back. Sorry, Belinda has just posted a comment, and it's made me laugh for a reason, and I'll tell you the story because it's kind of amusing. But that's where talking about like coming back to that hormone implant might be an idea as well. So we'll touch base back on that. But before we do that, we'll kind of move on to that last category of things that the interventions that we can put in place, and that's the social kind of category there, which is the next one. In the same thing here, I'll let you get us started. And
so what we're talking about with the social aspect is anything or anyone that bird perceives to be a mate. Interactions between that bird and that thing or person or other bird can stimulate that reproductive drive. So the big one that is probably the most problematic that I see is inappropriate touching between an owner and their bird. Anything below the beak in terms of touching can be perceived as sexual by that bird. Stroking down the back particularly is very sexual, and we need to try and avoid doing those sorts of things and foster a more platonic relationship with our birds. It's certainly feeding a bird from your own mouth, which people do, is probably something best to avoid, because that is a very, very common courtship behavior that birds will engage in. So allowing your bird to rub its bottom on you, rub its vent on you is definitely best to avoid that. So what that bird is doing is masturbating, and we want to try and prevent that, because when we allow that behavior, we're kind of reinforcing that kind of sexual bond that the bird has, and we want to avoid that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd add in there, as much as we love having our birds right around our shoulders and hang out with us, and, I don't necessarily have an issue with your bird spending a little bit of time on your shoulder. There's no issue there with dominance or anything like that. But they are very close to our face and they're hard to read when they're on your shoulder. So it is dangerous if you've got an unpredictable bird. But more so than that, it's very much a very kind of simulating that sitting close with their partner, spending time kind of next to each other, very close together for long periods of time that they would do with that mate that they have in the wild. And so this riding around kind of right here tucked into our neck and shoulder and stuff for long periods of time, which I do see really regularly for hours in some cases, or sitting on the couch with them snuggled into our chest or on our shoulder, or in our clothes for conures is a really common one. It really is just solidifying that pair bond and driving those breeding behaviours in our birds. And so as much as, like I said, I understand how much we love having them there and hanging out with us, and sometimes it can be hard to get them to not be there because that's where they want to be. We do need to encourage our birds to actually be independent, to spend time off us, and to have a more. And I guess the other thing that I see with that is that the relationship can be so one-faceted that it falls apart easily under stress as well. And so I then start to see these relationships where it's really become very dysfunctional, and problems start to arise between the bird and the perceived pair as well. And it's often because it's a very one-faceted relationship where it's all about this and there's nothing much else going on. And so I really encourage my clients to have multifaceted relationships where they have different meaningful interactions with the bird. It's not just sitting on us. It's do foraging activities with your bird, because that's what they would do in the wild. They would forage with their flock. Do training activities with your bird. Have them do side-by-side activities where they're doing their own thing and you're working nearby. Have them, foraging in a different space while you do other things. And yes, they can spend a little bit of time with you, sitting with you or sitting on your knee or somewhere like that, but have lots of different interactions and have other people engage in all of those different types of interactions as well. Because yes, one, I see a lot of pair bonding that leads to biting of other people in the house, reproductive behaviors, et cetera, but I also see a lot of dysfunctional relationships because they just have, there's only this one facet to the relationship, and if that starts to fall apart, things go bad really quickly. So super important to really have lots of meaningful interactions with your bird in different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I guess the other side of things is if your bird is not bonded with a person but is bonded with another bird, and those birds are paired up and they're being reproductive, that's a bit of a tricky one, because there is a school of thought that says we should deny those birds access to each other, and completely eliminate physical, auditory, and visual contact. We know that in cockatiels, just the sound of a male cockatiel's voice is enough to stimulate a reproductive activity. But the problem is, if we separate those birds, the adverse consequences can be significant. And it can be really, really stressful. And personally, I'm not a big advocate for separating birds in that scenario. I think we need to focus more on the other things that we can control. And keep in mind that, we are more concerned about those physical reproductive problems in the female birds, but all of this in terms of behavior applies to the male bird as well. So we need to, if we have a same-sex bonded pair as pets that are getting reproductive, we need to be managing both birds and reducing that reproductive drive.
Yeah. And like you said, it can be hard, and sometimes you might be working against the grain a little bit, but like you said, if you work with both birds, and again, such a big part of breeding is, can I feed my mate and my babies? And if we're just making that pretty much impossible because we're feeding an appropriate amount of food for those birds to not be hungry, but to be, questioning whether there's enough for them to then feed others, and we're making them work for that, that in and of itself can be a really effective way of reducing that problem in bonded pairs of birds. So if you have companion birds, certainly recommend trying to stick to the same sex, because you do have a little, do have a generally lower chance of that becoming a problem, but you will see same-sex couples as well, where they engage in reproductive behavior together. But you are certainly a lot less likely to see that if you choose to have 2 males or 2 females instead of a male and a female. So yes, yeah, absolutely. I was going to touch on something else and it's left my head, but that's okay. I'm sure it'll pop back up again at some stage anyway. So, the one-person bird myth. In most cases, I find that this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And what I mean by that is that we purchase birds. Someone in the family goes, I really want to insert species of parrot here. They go out, they get that. They've heard that birds will only choose one person to like, and then they really specifically then kind of cut other people out of that bird's life. So they do all of the feeding, all of the interactions, and kind of try and ask other people not to do that. And then what happens is, of course, because we've kept that social circle so small for that animal, they do end up just bonding to one person, or in some cases they decide that that person's too clingy and they bond to someone else entirely, which I see semi-occasionally. But we actually create that, when what we should be doing is looking at making equal relationships across the board from the get-go, socializing that bird to lots of different people, making sure it has meaningful interactions with lots of different people, because as much as you want your bird to love you, and in your attempt to control that, you may just create lots of behavior problems down the track. And it's cute when they're babies and they're cuddly and snuggly and just want scratches or whatever it happens to be. It's not cute when they hit maturity. It really is, and it becomes all sorts of issues. So socialize your birds and encourage lots of interaction between family members and whoever's visiting as well, within as long as it's safe.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Lee. I think that's so important, so important. Yeah.
And I mean, got to think long term as well. Your bird may not be able to stay with you forever, and limiting their social circle means that they may struggle to then integrate with somebody else down the track if they need to, which is really sad for that bird as well. So birds grieve really hard when they don't have more than one person in their lives, and it can be very, very detrimental to them in the long term. So we've got birds that live 40, 50, 60 years. We need to think about the long term, and that means making sure that they can go into other homes successfully. So
absolutely.
Awesome. So I did want to quickly, before we touch base on these questions, circle back to the hormone implants, and maybe just get you to let us know when are kind of the times where you're like, okay, this is hormone implant time.
Yeah. So often we'll use reproductive hormones or medications when we need to reduce that reproductive drive really rapidly. So if we have a bird that is in a reproductive crisis, often we'll use an implant or an injectable medication at that time to decrease that reproductive drive quickly, which then gives the client the opportunity to take some time to make those environmental changes at home. The thing to remember about all of these medications is that they're not made for birds. The hormone implant, the supralorin implant, is registered for dogs and ferrets. So we're using it off-label for birds, and birds have different GnRH to dogs and ferrets, which means that the implant was never designed for them. It can be effective, and it often works very well, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. We use them to buy us some time to manage those other reproductive drivers, and then often we don't need to use the implant again in future. Now, sometimes we need to use the implants in cases where the client has done everything they possibly can to manage the nutritional, environmental, and social factors, but the bird still has a reproductive problem. So the bird might be a chronic egg layer, or might keep getting egg bound or something like that. And in those cases, we will look at using hormone implants regularly in those birds as an adjunctive treatment to helping reduce the risk of those reproductive problems. Now, of course, we don't want to use medication if we don't need to. So, we're better off providing an appropriate environment for that bird in the first place. But sometimes we do need to use it as a part of the whole treatment. Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. It's certainly, and I don't see it terribly often recommended as a first, I guess, a first intervention, but it definitely isn't a first intervention unless obviously there's a medical reason for that bird,
Of course,
because
yeah.
there are some medical reasons, obviously, like you said, where the bird might be in danger if we don't just kind of switch that off as quickly as possible. So
Absolutely, yeah.
excellent. Have you ever seen birds? And I'm asking these questions purely because I know this is the sort of thing that people ask, or that they're thinking. Have you seen birds have negative reactions or any, side effects from those that are, people are wondering about? Is it safe? So.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Generally, the medications are quite safe. I think the first thing is that technically these medications are what we call a GnRH agonist, which means they're stimulating the same receptors that GnRH does, but they're what we call a superagonist. So they stimulate those receptors, but then effectively block those receptors. So theoretically, it could cause a bird to ovulate, but clinically, that doesn't really happen in my experience. The other thing is that the implant the implant itself, there's an injectable version of this medication and there's the implanted version. The implant tends to work better and last longer in my experience. The risk with the implant is that the implant is going under the bird's skin, and very, very occasionally birds will damage the skin over the site of the implant. Now, that's very uncommon. I have seen it a handful of times, and it can be quite serious when it does happen. But I find that even with birds that are feather destructive and feather damaging, the vast majority of those birds will not touch their implant. The implant is placed surgically under a brief general anaesthetic, and we provide adequate pain relief for the patient to make it as comfortable as possible. The skin heals at that kind of implantation site, and then over time the implant just dissolves, so it doesn't need to be removed at a later stage. Very, very occasionally a bird will chew at that implant, and sometimes we need to go in and surgically remove that and repair skin. In extreme cases, that can have quite serious negative outcomes, but again, it's very rare to see that. And of course, that's why that's part of the reason why we're focusing on the husbandry rather than just jumping for an implant with every bird with reproductive problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are generally less invasive, and
absolutely.
But as you said, these are very rare complications and side effects as well. That aren't. It's not that this is happening, for 90 or 80% of the birds. It's happening really, really rarely. So I know that's a question that I get asked, or I see people asking. So I think it's a good one to kind of touch base on. It's obviously, especially when birds are going under anesthesia or things are being implanted,
of course,
can be a bit concerned about that. So absolutely. No, thanks for that, because they're obviously, it's great that we have this option for our birds when it's needed, because the other options are kind of concerning. We don't have a lot of other options at the moment. Things like desexing procedures in birds isn't super common or generally recommended, I imagine. So
no, certainly not. Just the anatomy of birds means that they're just not. We can't desex them like we would with our domestic dogs and cats. The surgeries are very dangerous and can have life-threatening complications. So we just don't offer that as a routine treatment. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Well, we'll quickly jump in and try and answer some questions. So Sam has said he has a male eclectus that's 2 years, 3 months old, and is hormonal for the first time. He's mainly regurgitating to toys and humping them, super common in male eckies. And then, he asked, can I reduce this? Yes. Basically, and he asked this before we'd kind of started covering off on the intervention. So Sam, if you're still around, go back, listen to those interventions that we talked about, because that's definitely the way to start reducing that behavior, is to implement some of the stuff that Pat and I have talked about tonight. So so I'd also probably recommend something that we didn't talk about, but if your bird has particular toys that they like to regurgitate and hump on, get rid of those.
Yeah.
So, you know, if it's one particular toy or one or two particular types of toy, ditch those for a while, take them out, replace them with something that the bird doesn't seem interested in regurgitating for or humping. So just again, remove those opportunities to engage in that behavior.
Yeah.
Cool. So Kylie, you won't be able to see. Oh no, you can. There we go. So Kylie said, I found with my female 10-year-old mustache parrot that when I did reduce the fruit sugar content in her diet, she wasn't really eating what I was giving her, and she just always seemed to be starving by the time I got home from work. She always seems like she has ADHD, and just cannot. And I cannot trust her enough to leave her out for long periods of time, as she constantly tries to nest, even on me and under my clothes, although she's never laid an egg. She screams every time I walk into or out of the room. And now I can't see the rest of that comment for some reason. Thanks. Yeah, and Kylie, I think maybe we have had a consult before. That all sounds very familiar. So there seems like there's a lot going on there. And I guess, you know, this is, if we're doing all of the right things that we've talked about with Pat tonight, and we're really finding that, you know, we're not able to see success with that. I guess in this case, you know, Pat, would this be a case where you would go maybe, you know, a hormone management, you know, kind of medication might be appropriate, because we're, you know, trying to do all of the right things, but we're not seeing the response that we like. And then obviously we've got this quality of life issue where we have to go, okay, well, now I can't let the bird out of the cage as much because it's trying to nest. I guess my one thing there here in Australia is that we do have, and if you're in the position to have an outdoor aviary, even it doesn't have to be a huge one, but sometimes for birds like this, that can be a really great, you know, your bird doesn't need to live in there during the night time. It can be something you take them in and out of, but an aviary can be a great way to help with this, because instead of being stuck in an indoor cage when you're at work, we can have them out in a much larger space and give them more space to kind of exercise. And obviously it's not suitable for everyone. They don't necessarily live in the environment that allows for that, but that would be one thing that I would probably look at if it's a possibility within your situation, is, you know, adding that outdoor aviary space, because I have found with some birds that is huge, and it helps immensely with some of these problem behaviors. Anything to add there? I'll see if I can find the rest of it while you kind of chat. See if I can find the rest of that comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a fair bit to unpack there, but certainly in a case like that where we've tried a lot of things and we're not feeling like we're getting a great response, that's the kind of case where, you know, really need to sit down and go through the nitty-gritty and scrutinize, okay, what have we done? What were the consequences of that? And kind of really get in and pick that apart. One thing I would say is that when we're making dietary changes with any bird, and regardless of whether we're making dietary changes or not, weighing our birds frequently is a really good thing to do. When we're doing a dietary change, weighing that bird every day in the morning before breakfast is really important. So if we're converting from a seed-based diet to a pellet-based diet, I think that's a really good thing to do. Or, as Lee said, if we're reducing the amount that we're feeding to try and decrease the calories, monitoring that bird's weight at that time is important as well. And if we're losing weight in that situation, and it's not weight loss that's been recommended, you know, by a veterinarian, then we know that we're having problems. We need to back off a bit. The other thing we can do is scrutinize what our birds' droppings look like, because when a bird is not eating enough, their feces will change. So knowing what your bird's normal feces look like allows you to identify when there are abnormalities. So, for example, when a bird is eating very little or nothing at all, or not getting enough food, you might notice that the fecal portion or the green-brown portion of their feces becomes really dark and kind of mucoid, and that can be an indicator that actually this bird's not getting enough food and we need to increase the food intake. So that was one thing that I would mention about that. Did you manage to find the rest of that question, Lee?
Unfortunately not. I'm not sure why Facebook is not letting me bring it up either, which is really annoying. So
it may be that this bird would benefit from some hormonal control, but certainly, you know, I would recommend before jumping to that, looking at doing a behavioural consultation with an avian vet to make sure that that is the most appropriate course of action. But there's certainly options for that patient.
Yeah, and yes, changing diet can be tricky. Some birds it can be quite easy. You reduce the fruit and sugar content, and you know they naturally start to just consume more other foods. But some birds can be incredibly picky, or they've had a really, you know, they just don't recognise the foods that we're offering as a food source, and it can be really tricky. And I think also, you know, talking to somebody about like what you can do to transition that bird a little bit more gently, so that we can get them on that more appropriate diet, but not be concerned about how much food they're consuming, is also another thing to kind of address as well. Because obviously, we definitely don't want our birds starving themselves. And then if we have to go back to feeding a high energy diet, then that's going to, like, probably high energy diets, you know, between that and you know, inappropriate handling from humans and pair bonds, those are probably the two main factors that if you can't control those, a lot of these other environmental changes that we make are going to be really unsuccessful, because we're just, you know, it's those two things are so huge for our birds. So if, you know, we're back on a really high energy diet because we were worried about the bird not eating enough, then that's something that we need to go back to as well, is talking about how we can more gently transition that bird onto a more appropriate diet. It might be a slower transition. So Kylie, I'll try and find your the rest of your comments afterwards. It's just Facebook is being fun and not showing me. I can't see it anywhere. It's very annoying. Cool. So someone said, if you use the same toys or equipment for foraging, is it really foraging? I mean, is it foraging? Yes. Is it enriching? No. So, you know, it is foraging. But, you know, foraging and enrichment, I guess you could separate into two different things. And I wouldn't necessarily call the same thing day in, day out enriching after a certain kind of time period. So, but absolutely, we recommend using lots of different things. Cool. So Sarah has said, are we wanting to decrease these drivers for repro behaviour all year round, or should we allow them to engage in normal behaviour during breeding months and just ensure we are not promoting prolonged seasons of plenty beyond this in their domestic environments? Are there any issues with suppressing the repro drive somewhat indefinitely? That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. I think I think the time of year where it's most important to do our best to not encourage reproductive drive is when these birds would normally be reproductive, because that's when we're most likely to see them run into those issues. I think you know, having them in a non-reproductive state throughout the year is I think is acceptable. And I think the way that we need to look at it is that we're simulating a maintenance or flocking lifestyle rather than stimulating the gonads to get that reproductive drive. So in my opinion, I would say that making efforts to reduce reproductive drive are appropriate all year round, but probably most important during that species breeding season.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a vet, but you can probably comment. I don't think there would be any physiological reasons that would make it bad to suppress reproductive drive year round. There's no reason why that would cause any issues for the bird long term. You're much more likely to get issues from the reproductive drive than from suppressing it.
Yeah, I agree, Lee. I can't think of any specific reasons why that would be an issue to not let them be reproductive. And like you say, I think we're more likely to run into problems if they are reproductive. Yeah.
And I think, even from a behavioural perspective, allowing them to engage in breeding and reproductive behaviour when there's no intention of follow through is causing frustration that we don't want to cause, because we're going, hey, here's all the things that are good to go, and then but then nothing comes from it. And so the animal's going into this reproductive drive and then never getting anywhere with it. And that might create more frustration as well. So I can't realistically think of any physiological or behavioral reasons where going through a breeding flush would be beneficial for a bird that isn't like actually breeding.
Yeah, yeah. Great question, Sarah. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so as well. Awesome. So Belinda's comment was, don't trust scrambling to stop a potentially fertile egg from hatching. So Belinda has a pair of crimson-bellied conures who have bred a number of times, and she's raised them, but she decided she didn't want them to breed anymore. So she was scrambling the eggs, gave them a good old shake, and then putting them back just so that
ineffective.
Yeah. So now she has a baby bird named Scramble.
Yep. Okay.
So I thought it's kind of amusing, but yeah, absolutely don't. Scrambling the egg doesn't necessarily, I mean, it should work. They can be pretty sensitive to being kind of knocked around and shaken.
Absolutely. I'm surprised.
Especially if you're like really giving them a good, yeah, pretty impressive. So he's a little bit special. No, he's lovely, isn't he, Belinda? Yes. Sam said human saliva is toxic, isn't it? Yes, that's another really good reason. I don't know if toxic's quite the correct word, but certainly it's no good for our birds to be coming into contact with our human saliva.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's toxic, but we certainly could be carrying microorganisms that, if that bird ingested those microorganisms, we could get a gastrointestinal upset. So I would just avoid that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Alicia has asked, how long are you getting out of your implants, please, doctor?
Yeah, so it really varies on a case-by-case basis. There's two sizes of implants. And this is in inverted commas, 6 months and 12 months, because that's what they're registered for in dogs and ferrets. We find that the 6-month implants often are effective for 6 months, but not necessarily. The 12-month implants for some birds will be effective for 12 months. Some of them don't last as long. We also use these implants off-label in backyard chickens, and we find that those birds tend to burn through implants a lot quicker than our companion parrots. But those birds are also bred to produce ridiculous numbers of eggs. So they have a really strong innate reproductive drive. They're not a wild bird. They are a domesticated bird, but they've been domesticated to produce eggs. So I do often see a 6-month implant last 6 months, and sometimes it seems like it's lasting longer. But I think that the bird was just not going to enter a reproductive state anyway when the implant ran out. Okay.
Yeah, I guess it can be hard because if those clients are then going home and also implementing everything else that we've talked about tonight, then you're not necessarily, it might have run out, but because they've done such a good job of changing all of those diet environmental factors, the bird just doesn't go back into a reproductive state anyways. Yeah. So, I guess it would be a really hard thing to necessarily measure too.
The other thing is that for some birds that require an implant, often we'll use a 6-month implant, but time it in a part of the year that's appropriate for that bird. So if we know that there's a certain time of year where that bird is reproductive and we have these problems, we can time our 6-month implant to kind of give us some extra preventative measure during that time frame. But then for the rest of the year, they don't need it. So they don't need a 12-month implant every year. They just need a 6-month implant used thoughtfully. Yeah, cool. Excellent question. So Sam kind of came back after our answers to him about his Eki, and he said that he's doing pretty much everything that we've advised, and it's all of his toys. So in that case, I'd probably recommend starting either with a behavior consult with either your avian vet or someone like ourselves, an avian behavior consultant, because often, there are still things that can be changed and worked on within the environment that you might not recognize yourself, but that someone who is a professional would recognize. So, and it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all. So as you say, Lee, we try and identify factors within that bird's life that we can alter to make a meaningful difference. Yeah,
excellent. So I've got a question there about aggressive behavior, but I'm going to skip that one because it's not, it might be related to hormone production, but it's more about aggression. And I can't see your name, but I would start with what we've talked about tonight, obviously, as a starting point is to discuss, to go over, your diet, those environmental factors as a starting point to see if it helps to reduce the aggression. But, if you're seeing significant aggression, then, that's a behavior consult for, someone to work with you on, because it's really hard to make suggestions without any more information than how old the bird is. So we have a 70 question pre-consult form that we get clients to fill out, so that we've got really significant history before we work with clients, and we can make sure that we're really factoring everything in before we give advice, because the wrong advice for the wrong bird can make things a lot worse as well. And there's just no generic like do this. So as like I said, as a starting point, certainly addressing the areas that we've talked about tonight with Pat can be a big one, because even if it's not hormonal, sometimes it's the bird is just amped up on excessive sugar and there's nowhere for that energy to go, and it's coming out in these aggressive behaviors. So certainly going over all of those, but I would also recommend a consult with somebody of the behaviour consulting specialty so that they can really work with you on your individual case. What else? Someone said that their bird's part piranha. Sam has asked, this is kind of off topic, but we'll touch base on it. Can you recommend a pellet for eclectus?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different options. I do like Supreme pellets. They make a number of different pellets, and I can't remember specific formulations, but they will produce something that is appropriate for eclectus parents. Vetifarm produces an eclectus specific pellet that is low in iron. So one of those two, I think, would probably be ideal.
So the Vetifarm is Paradise pellets. I'm not sure about the Supreme specific one, but the Vetifarm one is Paradise pellets. And I've used both of those personally with my own birds and my own Eki. So yeah, I've been happy with them at this point. Awesome. Oh, okay. The rest of Kylie's question was that she lives in regional Western Australia, so she doesn't have access to an avian vet. The closest is 6 hours away, and would we recommend making a trip to see one? So yeah, but thanks for dropping that in there and giving us that information. That can be hard, and I lived in regional Western Australia for a number of years as well, except I was 18 hours from the nearest station, and it can be really challenging. I'm not sure if they can provide kind of remote access consultations. It might be worth contacting a couple of the avian vets. I'm assuming Perth is probably your closest avian vet. I think it would probably be worth contacting a few of them and seeing if they're able to even do, start out with a Zoom consultation to see what they think before you make the trip necessarily. If they go, yeah, absolutely, this is a case where we think that reproductive medication might be helpful, then great, make the 6 hour trip. On the same vein, I guess having regular a health check is probably not the worst thing for your bird if they haven't had one in a number of years because of your location as well. So
I agree, Lee. I think it's certainly worth contacting the closest clinic and making an arrangement that would be suitable for your travel, and to ensure that the clinic can book out the appropriate amount of time for your bird. Our clinic is in Southeast Queensland, but we have clients from all over the state, so it can be done. It is inconvenient, and we completely understand that. But certainly, if the planning is appropriate and the clinic is aware of the situation, then I think certainly that would be beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. I think Alicia just said thanks for doing this lecture. 6 of her avian education students for non-canine assistance animals and her have really made the most of it. Awesome. We're super, that's exactly why we do these, just to, get this information out to people as much as possible. And, there's a lot of misinformation out there as well, unfortunately. And so we really just want to try and clear things up and clear up some of those misconceptions that are kind of, like I said at the start, you see a lot of people that just think that you just have to put up with it. Like, it's hormones, it happens, your bird's going to do it every year, it's going to last this long, and it is what it is. And then birds get given up because people are like, well, I can't change this behavior, when there's lots that we can do. So yeah. So I'm glad you're getting things out of it. She also said her avian vet is only getting about 3 months out of the 12-month implant. So I think, it can be
every
hard
bird
with
is
some.
different.
Yeah, and I mean, some birds don't respond to it at all.
In
some cases. So
yeah, I've certainly had cockatiels that it's lasted less than 2 months. It's every bird is different. So it's certainly not a one size fits all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have in case of needs, but it's not gonna be there's no magic wands, unfortunately, when it comes to these things. Yep, that's it. Awesome. And Belinda said, you guys are legends. Thanks, Belinda.
Thanks, Belinda.
Awesome. I think that's all of the questions we've got so far. So we've kept Pat here for much longer than I had initially anticipated tonight. So.
Absolutely fine. It's been great.
It's been awesome. Thank you. We've had a really consistent group of people hanging around for, so lots of you stuck in with us, even though we've been going for well over an hour and a half now. So awesome. Thanks for sticking around and listening to us talk about this. Like I said, very important topic. But thank you so much, Pat, for coming along and putting together that presentation for us to cover off on everything, and for sharing your expertise and your clinical experiences, because I think it's really important, not just for people to hear it from me, but to hear it from that, that vet and that clinical perspective as well, because it's such an important topic. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank you for all the work that you do through Parrot Life. I think that the work that Parrot Life does is so important and so valuable, especially considering the fact that you can supply advice and care to people anywhere through telehealth. I think that's really important and fantastic. So avian vets really appreciate the work that you guys do. Thank you, and obviously we appreciate all the work that you guys do as well. Certainly our jobs are, it's nice when we get referrals from yourselves and other avian vets, because most of the time it means that, some of the work's already done as well. Like, we get there and the clients are already feeding a better diet and doing foraging, and we can really dig down into, the other areas that we need to work on. So, it's really fantastic to get to work with lots of fabulous avian vets as well. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you to everyone. I've got a few people saying thanks, very informative, and appreciating our time. So thank you very much for joining us. And that's about it. I don't think we'll have any more lives before Christmas. So I hope everybody has a wonderful Christmas and New Year's. But I do have hopefully one planned for the new year on another topic that I'm really passionate and think is really important as well. So keep an eye out for that. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful night. See you later. Thanks, everyone.